Before getting into the content of this video, I want to mention two things. One is that part of the reason there was only one video last week instead of the normal two was because I've been working on a longer video regarding the subject of violence and how that is addressed in the Torah, and by extension, the question of self-defense as it pertains to the Torah. That is going to be a longer one, and hopefully it will be done by the end of this week. If not, it should be done toward the beginning of next week. The other thing is somewhat related to this, which is if you haven't signed up on my website yet on rememberthecommands.com in order to stay in touch with me, feel free to do that, because there's this possibility that if I talk about certain subjects that maybe not now, but with these shifting lines of what is acceptable on the internet nowadays, there may be a time when that is considered unacceptable, certain things that I intend to talk about or have talked about. So in that case, if you want to continue to stay in touch, then if you are signed up on the website for the newsletter, then I will be able to get in touch with you and let you know what is going on. Don't worry about any spam or anything. I won't spam you. And for those of you that have already signed up, I have not sent anything out yet, but I am considering some possibility of exclusive content that may be shared through that means only for now. So that is a possibility, but we will see going into the future. So that's all I wanted to say. Here's the video. Over the years, I have thought about the different people that I've known or met that have gotten interested in the Torah. Specifically those that were not raised in observance, and that would include me. While I would not group all of us into any particular category, nor would I assume any quality or trait applies to everyone, there are a few patterns that I've noticed among some of us or among those who may be peripheral to us. The set of patterns I wanted to talk about in this video is the tendency toward non-conformist thinking. Depending upon how a person looks at this tendency or how they feel about it, it could be described as being skeptical or independent-minded, or with a more negative spin, it could be described as being a rebel or being a contrarian. If you think about it, by the very nature of our situation, this is entirely to be expected because many of our beliefs are not the mainstream view. As far as our beliefs are concerned, some of them may never have even been recognized by the majority group, so we might be seen as unorthodox in those terms. As a result, it's only natural that in order to get into such a belief system to begin with, a person would need to be able to entertain that the majority may not be right. Those that are willing to do that would include the people that are willing to think critically and to step outside of the norm and do what they believe is right. And it would also include people that are inclined to think that the majority is wrong by default. That's not to say these two qualities could not overlap or that there are not other important factors at play. And that's not to dismiss any underlying positive intent, but in such a situation, we can expect to see more of that than in the normal population. For me personally, I have observed that I have some of those tendencies where I have been inclined to be skeptical of the officials or the experts and sometimes challenge things or question things just as an almost automatic unconscious response. Obviously, I think that can be useful because I wouldn't be here today if I didn't believe that Elohim wants us to follow his commands today. And one reason I was able to accept that belief was because I didn't just assume that the supposed authorities on Scripture were right whenever they said that following Elohim's commands was somehow the wrong thing to do. On the other hand, I can also see ways that it does not always benefit me to have that view. And in some ways, I think I have tried to kind of dial back the nonconformism and the contrarianism over the years. One might even characterize it as being willing to be skeptical of the skepticism. To be clear, I'm not saying that this is some kind of binary thing where a person is either a contrarian or they're a conformist, and I think that both inclinations can exist in a person at the same time and then either compete with one another or just show up in different contexts. For example, a person can be strongly critical of prominent views and then seemingly be very accepting and uncritical of less prominent views. While being careful and skeptical can certainly be useful, the relaxing of that when it comes to less and less popular views may not always be useful. The response that some might have is that this should be a simple issue, people just need to exercise moderation, just like hypothetically with everything except for observance, but I don't think that would tell me anything practical. The problem with a lot of these accepted wisdoms about just choosing moderation or relying on common sense or choosing the simplest explanation is that they don't often have any real underlying criteria behind them. It ultimately just comes down to a person's personal views, which are used to define what is common sense or what moderation looks like or what the obvious explanation should be. I don't think that would actually inform anyone of anything. So instead, what I'm focusing on is just the recognition of this phenomenon. For me, as I've mentioned in the past, early in my pursuit of the Torah, I became aware of some of the prominent Karaite teachings. As a result, I was exposed to heavy criticism of the rabbinic traditions, and I still believe a lot of that is certainly warranted. There are a lot of things in the traditions that either go against the Torah or come across as downright absurd at times. However, I think that initial experience created a heuristic in me that was not entirely useful. I know that with some things, whenever I would encounter a rabbinic view that at face value it seemed off or seemed to contradict something I thought I knew, my tendency was to just assume that this is another one of those unreasonable views, instead of entertaining the possibility that maybe there is something behind the view that I simply don't understand right now because I lack some piece of knowledge. My internal process would just tell me that it was probably just another incorrect claim. To be fair, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of the time the explanation that accompanies these claims is often poor. The stated reasoning is often not sound in my view, or it doesn't include what I would consider to be the best points in their favor. So in the absence of that, one might naturally assume that there is nothing else behind it. But considering all of that, now I try to be more cautious about making those assumptions because they could still be right for the wrong reasons or something like that, or maybe it could hint at a possible truth, or maybe it could be used to support another actual piece of evidence. Clearly, I do think we should be skeptical of these things, but for me, I try to avoid assuming too much just because a claim sounds odd. Part of that has just come out of studying over the course of time, and some of these traditional views, which I initially considered to be wacky or unreasonable, I later realized could be justified with other pieces of evidence. The flip side of that, which I alluded to earlier, might be the tendency to be less critical of things that the majority is critical of. For me, whenever I first started getting into the Torah, alongside that I started wondering about other things which had been disregarded by the mainstream, such as other old books, which some people considered scripture and other people didn't. Initially, I looked into books like the ones in the Apocrypha, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Book of the Watchers, and the more modern book which claims to be the Book of Yashar. But after my initial exploration phase, I didn't ultimately regard any of them as significant or especially credible. Even though that took place over a relatively short period of time, I can see how I sort of went through a process of opening up to the possibility of all of these normally rejected works. I think this is something that is natural in such a situation, not just with looking at other books, but with exploring different ideas in general. And it makes sense that if a person is in the process of changing their beliefs, that they're going to be lowering their guard about certain things that they may not have been as open to in the past. From what I have seen for some people, that process tends to be very rigid and very quick, and you've probably known people that were very fixed with their beliefs and very closed-minded, but something happened and for some reason they changed their beliefs. And then as soon as that change process was over, those new beliefs became the new, very rigid and very fixed and very closed beliefs. For me, I do think it can be useful to remain open to challenging and to developing beliefs and to be open to reevaluating perspectives on commands, for example, because it's simply not possible that whenever we first decide to observe the Torah, that we are going to know 100% everything there is to know about the Torah. There's no way we're going to come to exactly the correct conclusions on everything the first time we think about it, if it even is possible to ever arrive at full knowledge. I can understand the perceived need to be rigid on things because it's simply not comfortable to lack that stability in one's mind, especially when it comes to one's core beliefs. And at the same time, I can see how that practice can prevent someone from seeing some things which should be obvious or would otherwise be obvious if we weren't in that mindset. So there is this possibility of being more or less open depending on our situation and our personal approach to things. One last practice related to this that I wanted to identify is a pursuit of novelty. Going along with the tendency to be skeptical of the majority view, which is completely understandable, there can also be what some might see as a continual pursuit of overthrowing all convention, or possibly assuming that a unique and novel view might automatically be more credible just because it's different from convention. This, of course, like with the other ones, could be rather subjective in how we evaluate it, because I imagine that some people from my past probably assume that I am doing that very thing with my pursuit of Elohim, even though I myself perceive it as trying to pursue him and trying to pursue truth. In my mind, I'm not thinking that I'm taking some strange view because it's not the normal view. So even when someone is trying to be introspective about these things, we have all these explanations in our mind for what we are doing. So even if we truly were inclined to latch onto contrarian views and just to assume them to be more credible, even if there might be a lack of evidence, we probably aren't going to see it that way. We probably aren't immediately going to think we actually are doing that, even if we were. So these are some ideas that I was considering and that I wanted to share. I think all of us can probably relate to some of these things on some level. If you personally may not have had any of these inclinations in any form, maybe you have witnessed something similar going on at some point. I bring up all of these ideas because even though it's not a direct issue of command by itself, it is something that I believe is natural in our community, so to speak, and if that is true, then it easily could have an effect, either positive or negative, with regard to individual commands, or even with regard to a hypothetical future community situation. My purpose in this video was to simply draw attention to these patterns and to put a frame around them, rather than assuming to know where the balance supposedly lies.